All right, we're going to get started because I'm going to be more late than we are. So without further ado, we're going to...
So hello, I'm Rachel Russell,
Sorry.
and I've come from University College. So today I'm going to be talking through a paper called The Deflationists Error. And this paper is part of a broader project that investigates timelessness, and namely physical and philosophical theories that claim that there's no time. So as a result, then there's kind of two things that I need to address today. One being the aim of the paper in itself, kind of in isolation, and then two, how it then connects to the overarching aim of the project on timelessness. So I'm going to start with the paper in isolation and the problem that it attempts to tackle, and then towards the end of the talk, that's when I'll explain, the context in which this paper unfolds. In other words, how it kind of relates to the broader project. Okay. Okay. So in this paper, I identify an ontological debate between within the philosophy of time between temporarists and permanentists. So this debate turned on the question of whether or not the ontology of the world changes. So temporarists argue that ontological facts change, that sometimes things can begin and or cease to exist, whereas permanentists argue that ontological facts are eternal. So always everything exists forever. And temporarism and permanentism are implied by more specific views in the philosophy of time. For example, eternalism, the view that past and future objects exist well present, implies permanentism because if all events, past, present, and future, all exist, then ontological facts don't change, but it comes into or goes out of existence. Then presentism, on the other hand, the view that only the present exists, is also kind of closely associated with temporarism, since if all that exists is present and kind of given that we don't think reality consists of a static, unchanging present moment, then ontological facts change. Okay, so the problem then, there are some authors, I'll call them deflationists about temporal ontology, who have questioned the substance of these kinds of debates. So typically they question the substance of the presentism eternalism debate, but their thinking can also be applied to the temporarism and permanentism debate as well. So what the deflationist argues is that disagreements about temporal ontology are just in some sense merely verbal, and therefore the disagreements are insubstantial. So in other words, temporarists and permanentists, for example, just appear to disagree because of kind of their respective choices in language when describing temporal reality. But yeah, it's not a genuine disagreement. And then you have the substantialist, and kind of who argues in contrast or in opposition to the deflationist, who defends the substance of debates about temporal ontology. So this is where I come in this paper. Basically, my aim is to argue against the deflationist about temporal ontology by highlighting where exactly I think the deflationist goes wrong. I argue that temporarists and permanentists can agree on some temporal matters, and yet maintain the existence of a genuine dispute. And I suggest that it's this agreement that does exist between temporarists and permanentists, that leads the deflationists to wrongly claim that the disagreements about temporal ontology are not genuine. Okay. So the plan for the remainder of the talk, and the talk will be divided into 3 sections. In the first section, I'm going to briefly describe one of the main kinds of arguments in favor of deflationism about temporal ontology, and then I'm going to outline the main kinds of responses that substantialists have presented to this argument. In the second section, I describe another kind of argumentative method used by the deflationists called the translation scheme method. And I argue in favor of a certain kind of response to this argumentative method that is due to Ted Sider. And this is where I also suggest that the deflationists are misled by the fact that there is agreement that exists between temporalists and permanentists, just not the kind that would make the debate merely verbal. And then finally, in the third section, I'm going to expand on these points of agreement and explain how they might be able to tell us a little bit more about what it would mean for our world at that time. So that's in the final section. I'll connect it back to the broader project on timelessness. Okay. So starting with the deflationist main argument and its responses. So the main argument that gets advanced by deflationists is called the triviality argument. And many deflationists have addressed their arguments towards the debate between presentists and eternalists specifically. So as I've already explained, presentism and eternalism either imply or are closely associated with temporalism. Oh yes, with temporarism and permanentism, respectively. So for the purposes of this presentation, and given that like much of the deflationist literature is aimed specifically at the presentism and eternalism debate, from here on in, I'm just going to refer to that debate when describing the triviality argument and deflationism more generally. However, kind of as a sort of a side issue that, just as a side issue, I do think that the presentism, eternalism distinction is best understood in terms of the temporalist, permanentist distinction when arguing against the deflationist, because the temporalist permanentist distinction turns on what exists, whereas the differences between presentism and eternalism, as they're commonly described in the context of the A-B theory debate, seem to pertain more to like objective versus relative presentness. So basically, since A and B theorists don't necessarily wear their ontological commitments on their sleeves, I think it's much easier then for the deflationists to interpret the differences between them as being insubstantial. But this is kind of a side issue. And for the purpose of this talk, I don't think it really matters if you agree with, my preference for understanding the presentism and eternalism debate in the lens of the temporalist permanentist distinction. I think that the argument should go through either way. Okay, so this triviality argument that's put forward by deflationists can be presented as an argument either against presentism solely or against both presentism and eternalism. So here's a way of expressing the triviality argument against presentism. So according to the standard definition of presentism, everything is present. That's equivalent to the thesis that for any x, if x exists, x is present. The predicate exists in the sentence for any x, if x exists, x is present, must be read as meaning either exists now or did does now or will exist. Thesis that for any x, if x exists now, x is present, is trivially true, since to exist now and to be present are the same. And the thesis that for any x, if x did, does now, or will exist, x is present, is obviously false, because, for example, dinosaurs, they're going to come up a few times. Dinosaurs did exist, but they're not present. So, in conclusion, presentism is either trivially true or obviously false. So this is the general kind of argument structure, and it's also being used as an argument against the substantiality, or against eternalism, since eternalism can be taken as the negation of presentism. But I'm not going to go through this right now. Okay, so the crux of the deflationist objection really is rooted in the second premise of the triviality argument. So this is the premise that the predicate exists must be read as either being present tense, so it exists now, or disjunctively tense, so meaning did, does now, or will exist. So this premise indicates an implicit commitment to a thesis that Lugano calls very serious tensism. The premise, or the thesis, that every natural language predication is inherently tensed, and as such, a lot of the substantialist responses to the triviality argument have focused on rejecting the second premise. So I won't at this point go into too much detail as to like the specific substantialist responses to the to premise 2 of the triviality argument. But I do want to just briefly outline the main kinds of responses that tend to come up. Okay, so generally speaking, substantialists employ 2 to 3 kinds of arguments when responding to the second premise of the triviality argument. They argue for the intelligibility of tenseless predication, so against the claim that exists has to be understood as present tense or disjunctively tense. 2, they might appeal to unrestricted quantification, which I'm going to get to in a little bit more detail later on. Or they might use a combination of the 2 of these methods. So by appealing to quantifiers that are both tenseless and unrestricted. So in general, substantialists have argued for the substance of the presentism eternalism debate by arguing that the standard claims of presentism and eternalism should be read as employing some combination of tenseless predication and unrestricted quantification. Okay, so given the kind of extensive literature spelling out the ways in which this claim can be hashed out, I'm happy to kind of set aside this issue for now. And I don't want to weigh in further on how exactly we need to employ tenseless predication or unrestricted quantification when responding to the deflationist. Instead, in the next section, what I kind of want to do instead is to build on that already existing substantialist literature by taking a slightly different approach to arguing against the deflationists. So I support the substantialist camp instead by highlighting where the deflationist goes wrong. Exactly. Okay. So in order to highlight where the deflationist goes wrong, I describe another kind of deflationist argument towards the presentism eternalism debate. Okay, so this kind of argumentative method is called the translation scheme method, and this is where the deflationist claims that every presentist assertion can be systematically translated into an assertion that eternalist would accept. So what the deflationist does is map true sentences of the presentist language to true sentences of the internalist language and vice versa, in order to show that there's no real disagreement between the two sides. Because if you can translate all of the true sentences that presentists would accept to sentences and internalists would accept, then there's no real disagreement. So I argue in favor of a certain kind of substantialist response to this method, which is due to cited, which is that whilst presentists and eternalists can agree on the truths of many sentences, they substantially disagree as to what the propositions of those sentences express. Okay, so let's look at an example then of a dialectic between a substantialist and a deflationist. Okay, so the deflationist claims that the dispute between presentists and eternalists is merely verbal, and that neither side really disagrees with what the other side means, whereas the substantialist, on the other hand, argues that presentists and eternalists disagree, for example, over whether dinosaurs exist. So presentists say that they don't, although they did, and eternalists say they do in the past. So in other words, eternalists accept and presentists deny that dinosaurs exist. However, the deflationist sees no genuine disagreement. Okay, so because of the deflationists' commitment to the very serious tensism thesis, exist in the sentence dinosaurs exist needs to be interpreted in one of three ways according to the deflationists. So if it means exists now, then both presentists and eternalists should agree that this is false. Dinosaurs don't exist now. If it means that dinosaurs do now or will exist, then both presentists and eternalists should agree that this is true. And if it means that dinosaurs once existed, then both presentists and eternalists should also agree that this is true. And as such, on this basis, the deflationist argues that the debate between presentists and eternalists is merely verbal. Okay, so, however, I agree with Sider, and I argue that presentists and eternalists may agree on the truth values of these sentences, but nevertheless they disagree as to the propositions that express. So consider the sentence, there used to be dinosaurs. Presentists and eternalists can agree on the truth of this sentence, but disagree on what makes it true. So for example, for the eternalist, this sentence is true, is made true by the fact that there are dinosaurs located at a time before now, whereas the presentist denies that past and future tense claims quantify over past and future tense or future entities. So rather, for the presentist, the sentence "there used to be dinosaurs" is true because it was the case that there is a dinosaur, and not because dinosaurs are located at some time or now. Okay. So eternalists and presentists can agree that there used to be dinosaurs, that the claim there used to be dinosaurs is true, but disagree as to what makes it true. And it's this agreement, I argue, that misleads the deflationist to claim that the debate is merely verbal. Okay. Right, so there's kind of, one or two things we need to clear up, which is that if we say that presentists and eternalists can agree on these sentences, but they mean different things when they agree on them, how then do we make sense of the genuine disagreement between the two sides? So one solution is unrestricted quantification in sense logic, which I kind of flagged earlier as one of the substantialist responses. So to kind of explain that a little bit, it's common for quantifiers to be restricted in various ways. So when I say there's no milk, I probably don't mean there's no milk in the whole world. What I probably mean is there's no milk in the fridge or in the house. But this also assumes that there's an unrestricted, there's also an unrestricted quantifier. So one to which there's no restriction applied. So similarly, in ordinary use, eternalists can often allow for quantifiers to be restricted to like the present time, for example. So when the sentence dinosaurs do not exist is used to mean that there are no dinosaurs located at the present time, for example. However, when an eternalist asserts that there are dinosaurs in the context of describing their ontological commitments, they intend to express unrestricted quantification. So in other words, when eternalists assert that there are dinosaurs, yet they mean this as an unrestricted claim, not as there now exists or there did, like do now or will exist dinosaurs. Okay, so similarly, when presentists reject that there are dinosaurs, they too suspend this restriction, and they deny that there are dinosaurs on the basis that dinosaurs do not exist, like unrestrictedly. Okay, so what this should have shown is that while there is agreement between presentists and eternalists, this doesn't imply that the debate is merely verbal. And I think that the deflationist error is in thinking that this kind of agreement necessarily leads to an insubstantial disagreement. So in the final section, what I'm going to do is kind of suggest that this agreement could potentially go further whilst presentists and eternalists and more broadly temporarists and permanentists can still maintain a genuine dispute between the two sides. So I suggest that kind of my claim is that presentists and eternalists can agree on further temporal matters as expressed through tense logic, whilst maintaining a substantial disagreement. And importantly, this is going to kind of contribute to an overarching investigation of timelessness. So this is where we get into that bit. So first, to make this kind of connection make sense, I'm going to just give a little bit of background as to the broader project. Okay, so throughout the course of my project, I've come to kind of explicitly identify a methodological barrier associated with investigating timelessness and theories that propose timelessness, namely that there's really no consensus within the philosophy of time as to what time consists in. So this is going to make it difficult to judge what it would mean for our world to lack time, and also what these kind of timeless theories are even proposing when they propose timelessness. So in response to this methodological barrier, I propose like a novel systematic approach to investigating timelessness, and this divides into two main parts. And the paper that I've discussed today fits into the first part of that analysis. So in the first part of my analysis, what I do is I identify major debates within the philosophy of time. I analyze each of these debates by identifying the opposing viewpoints involved in each. And then once I've identified the grounds on which these accounts disagree, I start to review what's left. So it becomes apparent pretty quickly that even amongst conflicting theories of time, some important overlap remains. And so by identifying these kind of points of agreement, I begin to discover what conditions are regularly associated with time, even amongst otherwise incompatible theories. So the paper that I've discussed today fits into this because it's one of those parts of the project that identifies a major debate in the philosophy of time, analyzes the points at which the views involved overlap in part ways. And then the final section of the paper kind of should use this agreement that's already uncovered between presentists and eternalists when responding to the deflationists as a starting point to uncover further agreement and more broad agreement as between temporarists and permanentists too. Okay, so just another kind of little side issue. Of course, where there is agreement between two sides of the debate is controversial. And so establishing what it would mean for our world to lack time then becomes a question of really what's central to a majority of theories of time. And this is a matter upon which philosophers can disagree. But my aim is just to identify the principles that I take to be widely accepted and those which I take to be less so, so kind of sliding scale. Importantly, this is like quite a far-reaching aim, and it's not something that I can do by looking at one example of a debate in the philosophy of time. So this paper is just one amongst several with the same kind of methodological structure. Okay. So at this point then, I only really want to suggest what these points of agreement between presentists and eternalists, contemporarists and permanentists might be, and what they could potentially tell us about timeless theories. And this is something I hope to kind of expand on at a later stage. So we've seen already that presentists and eternalists can agree on many natural language tense claims. But I suggest that there are also possibly tense logical principles on which presentists and eternalists, and then more broadly, temporarists and permanentists, so tense logical principles on which they should agree. So I suggest that they could agree on several core principles because of the manner in which quantifiers and tense operators interact, namely because of the introduction of tense operators to a quantificational logic allows for the expression of both temporarist and permanentist views if we adopt an untensed quantifier view, which is sort of, being alluded to already in the substantialist responses to the deflationists. So, if we adopt an untensed quantifier view, what this means is that the quantifier ranges over absolutely everything, and therefore over all absolutely and relatively past, present, and future objects, if there are any. So if this is true and there is kind of this agreement on these kinds of principles possible, then what exactly does this tell us about timeless theories? And the answer to this pertains to the second part of the overarching project. So, so in the second part of the project, or part of the analysis, this is where I start to apply my findings from the first part. So basically, in the second part of the analysis, assess a selection of kind of the most prominent physical and philosophical timeless theories. And I do this by evaluating which of the principles that I will identify in part one of the project, which are present and which are absent from each of these timeless theories. So the goal basically is to create a more detailed picture of what physical theories that claim there is no time are telling us, and then also how they stand in relation to one another. And so if it's, for example, just a kind of gesture towards one instance, if it's commonly agreed between temporalists and permanentists that, like, for example, things were the case and will be the case, that tense operators can be used to express temporal truths, and then perhaps a timeless theory that supports such claims being made could be said to have retained at least one of the conditions commonly associated with there being time. Okay. So basically the upshot of all this, it might be that there are many ways for a theory to be timeless, and no clear point at which a theory crosses threshold from being a theory of time to a timeless theory. But this is okay, because part of the aim of my project is to avoid having to make these kind of one for all judgments as to what is required for there to be time. And rather my aim is just to evaluate what conditions or principles are commonly associated with time, and which ones of those principles are lost, which one of those principles a given timeless theory retains or abandons, effectively. So the implication could be then that timelessness could have different implications depending on what timeless theory we're looking at specifically. Okay, so to conclude, I've addressed two things today. First, I've talked about the aim of the paper in isolation, which was to argue against the deflationists about temporal ontology by showing that there is this agreement between presentists and eternalists, but not the kind that would lead to an insubstantial disagreement. And then secondly, I've shown how this connects into a broader project and this kind of overarching investigation of timelessness. Namely, that if we analyze more closely the points at which temporalists and permanentists can agree on temporal matters, then we can start to build a picture of the conditions that are regularly associated with there being time amongst theories in the philosophy of time, and then in turn begin to understand what it would mean for our will to lack time, and what timeless theories, those theories that propose that there is no time, what they're telling us.
Finished a little early, so plenty of time for questions.
And maybe a comment, and then I'll put myself back in the queue with a question, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I think this comes up at the connection between part one and part two. So, I mean, I think that if we take kind of Sider's way of formulating what's at stake between presentists and eternalists, then you know, part of what's really central there is that for the presentists, but not for the eternalists, the tense operators are part of the fundamental ideology. In other words, you know, tense, you know, carves nature at its, you know, joints or something like that. But it's like, you know, part of the structure. So then, I guess I'm not sure what you mean when you say that both can agree on some tense logical claims. I mean, so when it comes to, it's just wrapping up the comment, I think when it comes to that other debate, what we have there, temporaryism and transientism, is that both positions are formulated within tense logic. So that's why kind of both you know, make use of the tense logic.
So I think that like, yeah, so I don't know if this will be satisfactory, but the way that I like, what I think is important when responding to the Deflationists is this kind of like question of what exists. And I think that the temporalist permanentist debate turns on that question more so than like as it's spelled out in the presentist eternalist debate. But then I understand that like is what you're saying kind of that the presentist tends to be like
Well, we can talk later.
Yeah,
But
okay,
maybe just, I guess it depends on what your deflation is about.
yeah, go on.
This is about the responsible deflationists you make in section 2.
Are people able to hear?
Oh yeah, I can. I'll try and speak loudly. So it seemed like you were making two different responses. One about which proposition is expressed by a given sentence, and another about what is the kind of, let's say, truth maker somewhere along the way. And it seemed like you want to make the truth maker claim, because like, many B theorists accept that there are certain propositions that involve tensors ineliminably. So yeah, say you're going the truth maker direction, which is how I want to interpret you. Tell me if that's wrong. It seems like if you go that route, you shouldn't start with the assumption that the presentists and the eternalists agree about all the sentences. There's plenty of sentences about truth making or explanation, presumably, that they're going to disagree with from the start, and they're never going to agree on. Are there any kind of ways of specifying that we're talking about those two? So I don't know. Just checking the interpretation is correct, and is the assumption okay given that interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like tested to the truth maker stuff, but I think what was the second thing again?
So, I mean, the first choice point is, is it really about truth makers or propositions you're expressing? Because there's issues with the proposition camp, I'm assuming you were going to truth making camp.
Yeah.
But then I kind of want to reject the deflationist right at the start and say, hey, here are some basic claims about truth making that my opponents disagree on, and that's why the debate is substantial.
Yeah, so you would say that they can't even agree on the sentences in the first place. But I think my whole thing is kind of that, like, if you're, speaking unrestrictedly, they can't agree. But when I'm talking about sentences, I'm kind of talking about like natural language tense claims. So eternalists like can talk about, eternalists can say, dinosaurs don't exist, and but they mean that as a restricted claim. You know what I mean? Like in the context of just, I don't know, or something, maybe. But yeah,
I don't know if I'm not arguing about. I mean, within the context of the natural language thing, the deflationists can get their argument going. But why should we accept that the only ways we can talk about time and natural language ones, given my metaphysicians having these other kinds of
Thank you very much for that. I've been thinking a lot about the difference between eternalism and a timeless world. And I have a suggestion for you in terms of things that presentists and eternalists agree on, which is they both agree there are temporal relations at the fundamental level of reality. They just disagree on twice. But they still agree that there are some. And this question of what does it mean for time to be real? I have come to cash that out in terms of, do you think there are temporal relations on the fundamental level? Which might be an alternative way of doing it. My question is about the distinction you're drawing between permanentism and eternalism, which is presumably permanentism will also encompass timeless worlds. It would be weird for a timeless theory to be a temporal.
Yeah, I think so.
And then you're going to get quite a big agreement, which is quite fun.
between
permanentism.
I know they're
awful
word.
We are useful but awful. Like that between a timeless and timeless world theorist. And that so you're going to have a big agreement in the shape of permanentism, and then exactly what you're doing. The question is going to be, what are they actually disagreeing on? And it's crazy how hard it is to answer that question.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
This is great.
5 minutes.
Sorry, I thought it would be more than yes in your answer. Wonderful.
Yeah, I think, well, it's something that I'll have to think more about as well. So like, yeah, I assume, like, I can't imagine a timeless world being one that would agree with the temporalist claim, like intuitively, but I, like, again, maybe never say never.
Is there anyone else who wants to get in? All right.
So I've got this question about how you're trying to like understand. Okay, so you're looking at the overlap between these theories.
Yeah.
Try and get some sort of agreement as to what time is, so then understand what a time is. I'm going to put it this way. What if one person in this debate is radically wrong? Right, so that the overlap really just sort of like abandons any hope of getting to like an understanding of time. And you can see this in other sorts of debates. And so like in cognitive science, if you ask like what is thought or something like that, there's such like disparate views on what that is, that the sort of agreement that you would have would just sort of like would be trivial things that they would agree on, but the actual phenomena that you're interested in just disappears. So why is this case not like
Yeah.
that?
So like, firstly, I'm trying a few different debates. So like a different kind of contrasting debates and going at it kind of systematically. The other thing, yeah, so basically, like my starting kind of thought in the whole thing was that if there's no kind of like minimal kind of thing that we're grasping onto as being time, then why do we have theories that are proposing themselves to be timeless theories? So in that sense, I'm kind of like, well, one thing would be like, if there's no even minimal sense in which there is like something that we can call time, then why call something timeless? And so that's maybe one way to look at it. But then the other thing is to kind of assume, well, there must be something even like very minimal that we're grasping onto, that has to like, you know, be time. So when I'm kind of saying like I'm looking at the overlap, what I'm going to come out with is like definitely not going to be some theory of time. It's going to be very, very minimal commitments. So I don't think it's something that could be like, you know, like very radically incorrect. Hopefully.
Follow up on that real fast?
Sure.
So, okay, cool, right? So you might think that, so when we're doing our theorizing and we come to different sort of theoretical conclusions, we started off with some sort of like pre-reflective notions, some sort of initial way of like specifying our explanation, right? You might call this like a bulk notion or something like that. Would you think that it would be fruitful to sort of investigate that? So there's people who are doing like this X-5 stuff on time now, right? Like trying to understand like the naive view of time.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be a useful way?
So I've looked at a good bit at the folk stuff on time, and basically what I'm trying to do is like I want to get away from looking at time through, you know, either a folk notion of time or a metaphysical notion of time or a like scientific notion of time, and because I think all of those, you know, types of investigating time are very, very overlapping. And so I think while it's kind of useful in like to look at them in isolation, I think ultimately what I'm going to argue is that it's like almost impossible to do so because of how overlapping the different disciplines are.
Talia, back to you.
If maybe just briefly about the arguments in part one again. Maybe could we go back to that slide? I mean, I don't know if what we talked about earlier would change my question, but a little bit further. I mean, the argument against the deflationists, the one about the truth makers.
And do try and speak up.
Oh yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way you put it there,
Yeah.
why should, suppose that we are that kind of deflationist, I'm not sure why that should move me. I mean, we have that sentence there. The sentence, there used to be dinosaurs, it looks very similar to the sentence that expresses the proposition that the presentist says is expressed with the original sentence.
Yeah.
So, yeah, as a question, what if the deflationist just says, you know, looks like one side is somehow telling me more of a story about what that first sentence, what makes that first sentence true, whereas the second side is telling me less. It's like it's, I don't know, makes itself true, something along those lines.
Yeah, I think like I think really where the like, you know, the part of the debate or the part of the response that is like more you know, it has more or something. I think it is when you start to talk about the like the untensed and unrestricted quantification when talking about claims. So maybe something like that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have an answer on the spot. I think for like. Yeah.
Maybe, but just briefly, one thing that you said earlier made me think that maybe you think that this dispute by itself really is less substantial than the temporarism, transientism one. Is that what you think? Like, because you said that those guys disagree about what exists, and that's really what we should say to the deflationists.
No, I think, well, I think with that, I think what I'm getting at there, and that's maybe not like fully cashed out yet, but what I'm getting at there is that because the temporarist permanentist debate, like is kind of like puts the ontological commitments to the forefront, that it's like with the presentist internalist debate, it's easier for the deflationists to be misled, like to make their error, because then you do have, now I don't know, like that's part of the kind of part of my thought process that's not quite like cashed out yet, but I think especially because you have maybe like eternalist views that are like a-theoretic and like the overlap there, whereas with temporarism versus permanentism, it's very much about what exists. So when you're making claims, it's harder to see you know, how they're not substantial differences, I think. But that could be kind of like, you know, an intuition that of mine. But yeah.
Okay, I think this is an easy question for you, but I'm not sure. So,
Yes, do you have?
so am I right in thinking one way to understand what you're saying is the eternalist and the presentist, or the temporarist and the et cetera, are they think that they're or the deflationist thinks that they're agreeing about everything, but actually they're mistaken, because in fact they're uttering different propositions, right? Or expressing different propositions. Is that the?
So what I'm getting at is that basically, to a certain extent, like, I don't know if I want to say this, but the deflationist is right to a certain extent in saying that there is agreement between these two sides. But then I'm saying it's not the kind of agreement that leads to an insubstantial disagreement, because of the like underlying ways that they understand these sentences. So because of what the sentences express.
So
it's like effectively a similar kind of, yeah, like similar to what you said, but I'm kind of, because of where I'm going with it, because of the kind of end goal that I am trying to draw out points of agreement, and kind of what I want to do is show that they are to a certain extent agreeing, but this doesn't mean that it's not a substantial disagreement.
So maybe maybe my issue is I'm sort of missing the difference between how you're using sentence and how I'm thinking of a proposition. But what I was thinking was that I'm wondering if all of the same points you're making could lead not to there's a genuine disagreement, but the two sides are really talking past each other because they are just looking at different propositions. And then I'm wondering if in order to not say that, you would need to come to some kind of discussion about truth makers. But I'm not sure if that.
Like I would need to say kind of from the get-go that they are disagreeing on those sentences because of what those sentences mean.
Or that they
Or what
it's
they're
not that they're mistaken and that they're really expressing different propositions. They are expressing the same proposition, but then you come to they're disagreeing about what makes it true. In part of a discussion of truth makers. But I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, no, that
I
might
feel
be
like I might have misunderstood something significant. But
I have a question.
I think this is a really interesting way of framing the initial debate. I think that's super helpful. And I think I'm just missing the step to your next project. So I'm wondering, like, if we're focused on what they agree about, it seemed like the whole first point was that they agree about the sentences, but they substantially disagree about what make them true. And so you said, let's focus on what they agree on. And then we can see a timeless view is rejecting what they agree on. But now I'm worried that like the timeless view is going to look really implausible because they're going to have to deny that like there used to be dinosaurs. They're going to have to deny that because like, the Ludlow those always include like an implicit tense. So I'm wondering like, am I right thinking that like the agreement is at the sentential level, perhaps propositional level, and that's what the timeless person is rejecting? Or are you thinking there's like deeper structure? The truth maker part maybe that they do actually have in common.
Yeah, so in this, like, because I'm going to be looking at like various different timeless theories, it might be the case that the timeless theorist does reject that, like even that basic level of agreement, and that just might be the case because it's kind of a very like drastic type of timelessness proposed by the theory. Or it might be a case where like it retains that. And I think that's just like, it just might be kind of like a, in the timeless theory that sounds crazy because maybe sometimes theories do, but I think that's something that I'll find out by applying the kind of positions. Yeah.
It's not a bit of a follow-up, really. So maybe your final project, what you want to do with the study suggestion, I don't know, is look for something in between sentential agreement and substantial agreement on truth makers. Because sometimes people have counter propositions where it's an open question whether the same sentence doesn't determine the same proposition. The same proposition doesn't necessarily determine the same truth maker. And that's likely where you need to find the stuff that is inconsistent with timelessness. Because I mean, timeless theorists, it's often just a choice whether you agree with the sentence. Say, okay, what shit can I find in my timeless theory, in virtue of which I get to say the ordinary stuff? Another person who's more keen to kind of be a theorist to everything says, no, there were never any dinosaurs, there's no future, there are no times. But actually they agree. So, but they're not disagreeing about truth makers, they're disagreeing about something kind of in between truth makers and sentence.
So is that kind of a suggestion?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's useful. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.